Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our room this afternoon. And for those of you who are first timers in the room, you are in the Mentoring Club, our room. This is a room set up by the Mentoring Club and Silicon Valley Startups Club on Clubhouse. And this is in partnership with also one of our mentors in the Mentoring Club, Sean Flynn. You may know him if you are in the startup space in Silicon Valley. He is well connected, so he might be somebody that you would like to connect with. And the Mentoring Club is a nonprofit organization. We are a global community connecting mentors and mentees. We're focusing on mentees who are trying to develop leadership skills in the workforce so that they can achieve their career and life goals. We want them to find meaningful work because that's how the leaders in them come out, and that's how they can create positive impact in the world. And as mentees become accomplished and successful leaders themselves, our dream is for them to become mentors to others. And for this session, as part of our setup, we have Roy Terry, and he is a communications coach, started as an engineer, came from Idaho, moved to Silicon Valley, and is now developing players. And Hong will be leading us in the interview of Roy. On to you, Hong.
Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Roy, for joining us today and be highlighted as a mentor to share your life and career journey, particularly arriving in Silicon Valley, be a player and actually also be a coach and mentor in Silicon Valley for others who aspire to be a player as well. Let's start from the beginning. Before you arrived in Silicon Valley, where did you come from and what did you do before coming to Silicon Valley?
I come from a pretty small place called Boise. It was small in those days, in the 50s and 60s. Before I came to Silicon Valley, I had lived in New York City and pursued my skills as a writer. I'd also lived in Seattle, where I was being electrical tech, and I also worked at Boeing Field around Seattle a bit. I came from upstate New York from college to Silicon Valley in 1982, where I had an opportunity to work in the microprocessor operations at Intel. Yeah, that was a semiconductor group. Our subgroup was quality reliability engineering. We had about 10 members, which required quite a bit of software support, software and computer support. So I was doing that and writing code. And they were heavy users of what was novel in those days, which was Unix and C language and all the utilities and so on. So I'd learned all about all those things in school. So I fit in and I became kind of a support person for the real engineers.
So you started off as a writer in New York City and came here to write programs. Is there any parallel there?
Parallel in the sense of it's fun to sit down with a blank slate and create something that works. What works in a C program is different from what works in a short story. But yeah, there is that. There is that sense of excitement of having an idea and sitting down and drafting it into something that can then go out into the world on its own and produce effects. So programs and stories have that in common. They produce effects, but programs run on computers and stories run on neurons.
What prompted you to come to Silicon Valley?
It's going to sound a little off-putting potentially, but I had a roommate in Queens. We lived in Queens. I'd gotten involved in computers, his physics curriculum in college, and he worked for Price Waterhouse. He did this coding on a DEC 10 or something, and he would bring home copies of Byte magazine that had pictures of things like the Altair. And I just thought computers were the dumbest thing ever, and punch cards, and anyone who wanted to program a machine just had to be really not very interesting. It was lucky, or it was happenstance that I ended up in Silicon Valley because I did go to school, focus on digital electronics, and then I found out that the software world was way more fun. And I got very, very fascinated with how our single computer could support so many users at the same time and how did that work. So that led me to Unix, and there were news groups and there was internet email in those days. And someone at Intel posted a message to a group looking for someone qualified in Unix and C, and golly willikers, that was me. So it was exciting, like I said, by happenstance. And I didn't even know much about state of the art. I didn't know really that much about the 8086. I figured it out fairly quickly. It sure was a nice place to be.
What did you discover at Silicon Valley, at Intel? Any particular player that you met early on?
There was a guy in my work group named Pat Gelsinger, and he sort of stood out. Everyone was pretty smart. I thought I was pretty smart. So we all collaborated. We did things, supported each other on the team. There was one guy named Pat Gelsinger was sometimes around and sometimes he wasn't. And I eventually discovered he was upstairs working on the CAD machines where they were finishing the design of the 8286. He impressed me as someone who was very focused and energetic. In those days, there was a culture at Intel. There was something they promoted called constructive confrontation, which has a lot of pluses and minuses. It's quite controversial. But the basic idea is if something's not working well on a team, you need to bring it up. That happened with me and Pat one time. So I remember him.
The other thing that Silicon Valley is known for is this whole startup ecosystem. Did you ever go there?
That was my next move out of Intel. I'd had enough of constructive confrontation, and Intel was a little bit, it's not the right word, it was a curious culture where, unlike most of Silicon Valley, they would track you, and if you didn't show up at the facility by, I don't know, what was it, 8:30, they would take your name down. You were on a list of bad behavior. So I went to a startup after that. This was a microprocessor-based software system. Of course, there was no internet in those days. There was not even barely networking. I was very impressed with the two founders. They had come from the newspaper automation business, so automation of the journalistic and the editorial side of newspapers. They created a system like that for broadcast news, so for radio and TV stations. And it was very exciting. They had international business. It was a very small group. I was like the third programmer. Yeah, that was the best offer and exciting. So it was a giant switch. That was when I really started to enjoy Silicon Valley, because even back then it was kind of hot and glamorous, and they sent me to London and Italy and all around to conferences, and it was a buzz. It was great.
The work and the career with a big company as opposed to a startup, how would you describe those to somebody starting out in life and would like to have a clue?
The world is vastly, vastly different now than it was then, of course. But even then, the choices were pretty obvious. If you stay in a corporation, depending on how dynamic that corporation could be, that could be the smartest thing ever. And you can definitely innovate in a corporation. And Intel had multiple technology development projects, where they would make experimental hardware, and then they try to develop the software for it, and then they'd evaluate the market capability. And so people were coming and going all the time at Intel. There was a lot going on. That's a good environment. In my case, however, my talents were sort of, I guess, more broad than they were technically deep. So I wasn't the most brilliant writing AI code. I was writing good code. And so when I got to a small company, then I got more variety, and I got to be part of sales and part of support, as well as part of development and even product management. I would suggest that someone needs to kind of consult their inner reflection on, what do I like? Do I want to be in the Wild West, so to speak, where I do a little bit of everything? Or do I want to be on a winning team and just contribute in a more specialized way? That's really the choice. I think that part hasn't changed.
From a work-life balance or work pressure point of view, how would you compare?
And let me make a little humor here. Work-life balance is, some people think it's a myth, and I'm among those people. In Silicon Valley, if you want to be part of something exciting, ordinarily balance goes out the window. But in terms of Intel versus a startup, or a corporation versus a startup, it could completely depend, because startups have their ups and downs. They have their lulls. They have their periods of stability. Same for corporations. But if you're in the wrong side of the corporation when bad things happen, you could be working 7 days a week.
Looking back at your younger self arriving in Silicon Valley, what kind of advice would you give your younger self?
I guess I would give it advice. I'd give it: sort yourself out. Decide what your priorities are. Because I was just kind of looking for the most fun gig and going from gig to gig. And my first startup experience lasted about 3.5 years, and then I went on to several others. And the last startup I was in actually lasted until 2009. I could have used a mentor, frankly. Now that you come around to it, I could have used a mentor, because a mentor would have sat me down and said, okay, you've seen this and this and this, and you're at this particular level, but you're not managing, or you're only a team manager, or you're only a project lead. What do you want to do? And then take concrete steps. So I kind of coasted for quite a long time because I was just having fun. And I was still pursuing writing projects and other kinds of skills, the second game, if you will. That's how I got into coaching.
You mainly coach CEOs and entrepreneurs, right, of startups.
Yes, and it's kind of a split. So yeah, I do pitch coaching and I do interior coaching of executives.
Can you summarize a little bit about your approach?
We do not realize as much as we could that all of our everyday interactions, how we navigate, can be thought of as an ongoing performance or as an ongoing reality TV show. Take that. And therefore, it's subject to analysis and planning and strategizing and making your way. I believe that most people get to a certain level of professional competence in their communication and their thinking, and they feel like, okay, I'm done. And I think that's an unfortunate error. Almost everyone could be much, much better if they focus.
To entrepreneurs is for them to be a Silicon Valley player at some point. So how would you advise them to take their startup to be a player?
Yeah, let me talk about that right where entrepreneurship meets playership, and that's in the pitch. The player in the pitch is different from the wannabe in the pitch. So the newcomer, it's not to say you couldn't start out as a wannabe and become a player, but the player, when they show up with the pitch, they have a confidence and energy that many people don't. And they also have a doggedness about how they're going to succeed. And this impresses potential team and it impresses investors when no matter what question you're asked, you have an answer because you've already thought it through. So players have already thought it through. Players have done a little bit of internal work in the sense of, where's my confidence or what do I need to show up and actually be bold? When those things start to happen, people see you as someone who potentially will make change, and that's a player.
Our world now with the internet and everything has become much more of a software world. Has there been any evolution and big change and differences?
The startup world is now bifurcated a lot more. Usually, in olden times, startup was almost always linked to hardware. There was some software going, but even the company that I started with in '83, we delivered a full system. We got the computers from the manufacturer. We had everything configured, hooked together, tested out, installed the software, the manuals, and all this stuff, and we would go visit them and put it all in and so on. So that was an old-fashioned time. These days, of course, we're all walking around with a powerful computer in our pocket. And it has incredible connectivity, and it has incredible usability, and it has sort of unlimited number of apps. And therefore, the possibilities to innovate are vastly different. So this is what has created the modern age, right? After the dot-com boom, now we have the sustained internet mobility app boom. I don't think there's any particular end to it in sight because we keep discovering more and more things that we can automate or improve. Although we've done a huge amount so far, I think there's still more because I think phones are going to be better and better adapted to tap into network-based or cloud-based AI. It's not going to stop getting better anytime soon. So this is where the cutting edges, people who want to innovate. The tricky part is, of course, that now, instead of there being, say, 10 legitimate startups in a year in Silicon Valley, there's 500 or 1,000. So differentiation is important, and that player-type presence is huge. So it's a big game now. It used to be a small game. Now it's a huge game, global.
There is a dimension that has surfaced now increasingly is the question about whether technology is for good or not so good.
Well, you're asking a philosopher question. I don't, I'm not qualified to really answer that as well. I mean, we can all notice that social networks have a rather extreme downsides. One of the motivations I have for helping people learn to pitch is I want more good guys to win or good gals to win because the powers that be, I don't know if the balance is really good. I'm pretty concerned about it.
For a younger person starting a career today, what do you think that person should start doing to get ready for this new world?
We already talked about a player being distinct from non-players, and I think actually everyone needs to make that choice, or maybe they've made it by default. Maybe it's how they feel when they wake up in the morning. But there are a large number of people, and their way is not wrong, but they're not players. What they want is stability, start a family, they want a stable occupation, they want to just enjoy life that way where the work is a component, but it's not the main thing. So assuming you're not in that group, and I don't have much advice for them, well, for anyone who's aiming to be a player or a founder or make an impact in Silicon Valley is there is a pitfall of thinking you have enough perspective to attack some big problem. Usually you don't. It takes seasoning. My advice to someone who wants to navigate and be on the good side rather than the other side is you do incremental projects or do incremental engagements with different kinds of startups or teams. Talk as much as you can to people with more experience and ask them about what are all the elements you need to put together for a successful startup or to innovate inside a company. Start practicing skills and strategies. We are always a nation of fads in terms of the next greatest idea. We have TED Talks and all these business publications talking about different aspects of leadership and innovation and so forth. But it forms this kind of gold mesh mentality. My advice is slow down, but keep going.
If you were to write a book about your career journey, what would the title be?
Well, I have two answers for that. I don't know if I'll ever write a book about my career journey. That sounds like a memoir. I can tell you the book I did write, which is aimed at people who want to make an impact. And the title of that book is Go Ahead, Make a Drama. Engineers often don't appreciate the power of communication and what it is to have a leadership impact. And they tend to back off and they tend to not want to be dramatic or not want to take charge. That's very, very unfortunate. And that I have personal experience with. So my advice to them is go ahead and make drama, because guess what? If you make drama, you'll learn faster. But yeah, and you're on the road to being a player, assuming you can keep all the plates spinning.
Thank you very much, Roy. Thanks for sharing your journey to Silicon Valley. Thanks for being part of the Mentoring Club.
Thanks, Hong. Thanks, Roy.